Russia announced a ceasefire, then violated it 1,820 times. Not once, not twice, 1,820 separate violations in a single day, while the world was watching, while diplomats were talking, while the cameras were rolling. And Russia still called it peace. That number is not a typo. It is not an exaggeration. It came directly from Ukraine's military, documented, logged, reported in real time. 1,820 ceasefire violations on the very day Ukraine declared its own truce and invited Russia to stop fighting. Here is what nobody is asking loudly enough. If a country announces a ceasefire and then violates it 1,820 times in one day, what exactly is the ceasefire for? Today we answer that question, and the answer is going to change the way you look at every diplomatic announcement coming out of Moscow from this point forward. Stay with me. Let's go back to how this started, because the sequence of events here matters enormously, and most coverage has already moved past the details without letting them land properly. Ukraine declared its ceasefire first, not Russia. On the night of May 5th, Zelensky announced that Ukraine would halt offensive operations beginning at midnight. No end date, open-ended, a genuine invitation to stop the killing, not for a parade, not for a photo opportunity, but as a real test of whether Russia wanted silence or just the appearance of it. The logic was deliberate. Ukraine was saying to the world, we will go first, we will hold the line, and whatever happens next is Russia's choice. Russia's choice was 1,820 violations, ballistic missiles, Shahed drones, artillery, across 5 Ukrainian regions simultaneously: Kramatorsk, Zaporizhia, Poltava, Kharkiv. City after city struck in the hours after Ukraine had declared its willingness to stop. 27 civilians killed, more than 118 wounded, including rescue workers who responded to the first strikes and were then hit by second strikes targeting them specifically. Let that land for a moment. Russia did not just violate the ceasefire, Russia struck the people trying to save the victims of the first violation. Zelensky did not use diplomatic language when he responded. He called Russian forces, and I want you to hear the exact phrase he used: Russian scumbags. Not adversaries, not the opposing side, scumbags. That is not the language of a man who believes there is a genuine peace process underway. That is the language of a leader watching his people die while the world discusses the optics of a ceasefire that was never real. Now here is the question that should be dominating every conversation in Washington and Brussels right now. If Russia violated Ukraine's ceasefire 1,820 times, what happens when Russia violates the next one? Because there will be a next one. That is what the pattern tells us. Russia has now declared multiple ceasefires across this conflict. Every single one has been used the same way, as a diplomatic instrument, not a military reality. Announce the pause. Let the world exhale. Gain the moral positioning of appearing to want peace, and then continue the war exactly as before, because the battlefield has not changed, and Moscow has given up nothing. This is not a theory. This is the documented record. And yet, the international community keeps treating each new Russian ceasefire announcement as if it might be the one that is real. Why? The answer requires understanding something about how information works in modern geopolitics. When Russia announces a ceasefire, it creates a news cycle. Headlines appear, commentators speculate, markets react, governments respond. The ceasefire becomes the story, regardless of whether it is real. And in the hours and days that follow, as the violations accumulate and the civilian death toll rises, those stories have to compete with the next news cycle, the next announcement, the next crisis somewhere else in the world. The attention moves on. The violations are logged but not felt. Russia has mastered this cycle. It understands that in a world of constant information, the announcement matters more than the action. The headline matters more than what happens after it. And a country with enough patience and enough willingness to absorb international criticism can use ceasefire announcements repeatedly as a tool of perception management without ever actually stopping the war. 1,820 violations is not a failure of implementation. it is a demonstration of intent. Russia was not trying to hold a ceasefire and failing. Russia was showing Ukraine, Europe, and Washington exactly what Russian ceasefires are worth. The message, delivered in missiles and drone strikes to 5 Ukrainian regions simultaneously, was not subtle. We announce what we want, we do what we want, and there is nothing you can do about it. But before we get to the ground situation, let's talk about something that has been almost entirely absent from mainstream coverage of this story: Russia's accusation. Because Moscow did not simply absorb Ukraine's claim of 1,820 violations. Russia's foreign ministry fired back immediately, accusing Ukraine of attacking Russian-occupied Crimea and Russia's Bryansk region during the very ceasefire Ukraine had declared. And here is why that matters. Not because Russia's accusation is credible, but because of what it reveals about Russian strategy. Russia does not need its accusations to be true. It needs them to create doubt, to muddy the information environment enough that audiences in Europe and America start to feel that both sides are equally at fault. That this is simply two countries that cannot stop fighting, rather than one country that invaded another and is now using ceasefire announcements as a propaganda tool while continuing to kill civilians. The technical term for this strategy is whataboutism, and Russia has refined it into an art form. Every documented Russian atrocity is met with a counter-accusation. Every confirmed civilian death is followed by a claim that Ukraine did something equivalent. Every piece of evidence is contested, reframed, and injected with enough uncertainty that the average news consumer, trying to follow events from London or Chicago or Berlin, gives up trying to understand who is right and concludes that the truth is simply unknowable. It is not unknowable. The record is clear. Ukraine did not invade Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukrainian forces are fighting on Ukrainian territory. Russian forces are fighting on land they seized illegally, in violation of international law, in a war that the United Nations General Assembly has repeatedly condemned. 1,820 violations happened on a day when Ukraine had declared a ceasefire. Russia's counter-accusation did not change that number. It just added noise. Now let's talk about what is actually happening on the ground. Because the military situation in Ukraine right now is not what most Western audiences understand it to be. The front line stretches over 1,000 kilometers. Russian forces have been grinding forward, slowly, at enormous cost but consistently, in the eastern Donetsk region. The city of Pokrovsk, which Ukrainian commanders describe as a critical logistics hub for their eastern defense, has been under sustained Russian pressure for months. Ukraine's air defense situation is genuinely difficult. The country can intercept drones with reasonable effectiveness, but ballistic missiles, the Iskander-M systems Russia has been firing in increasing numbers, require Patriot batteries to stop. And Ukraine does not have enough of them. In the strikes that followed Russia's ceasefire announcement, 11 ballistic missiles were fired. 1 was intercepted. 10 got through. 1 missile, intercepted, out of 11. That ratio tells you something important about the vulnerability Ukraine is operating under. And it explains why Zelensky has been pleading consistently with European partners for more air defense systems. Not as a political request, as a military necessity. Russia knows about this gap. The increasing use of ballistic missiles is not accidental. It is a calculated exploitation of Ukraine's most significant defensive weakness. And it is happening precisely at the moment when diplomatic conversations about ceasefires and peace plans are supposed to be giving Ukraine breathing room. The strikes on Naftogaz, Ukraine's state energy company, are particularly significant in this context. Russian forces hit gas facilities in Poltava and Kharkiv regions, killing 3 employees and 2 rescue workers, cutting gas supplies to nearly 3,500 customers. Energy infrastructure has been a consistent Russian target throughout this war, not because gas facilities are military targets, but because cutting energy supply to civilians, particularly heading into winter, creates pressure on Ukraine's population and government. It is a weapon aimed not at soldiers, but at the will of an entire society to continue resisting. And Russia is using that weapon while simultaneously announcing a ceasefire. Here is the dimension of this story that carries the most weight for Europe specifically. The 27 civilians killed in the strikes following Russia's ceasefire declaration did not die in a war zone. They died in cities, in their homes, in facilities that have nothing to do with military operations. Kramatorsk is a city. Zaporizhia is a city. These are places where people live, work, send their children to school, and try to maintain something resembling normal life in the middle of a war. For European audiences who remember what it meant to have war on their own continent, for people in Poland, in Germany, in France, in the Baltic states, who have spent decades believing that the post-war order guaranteed that this would never happen again, the images coming out of these Ukrainian cities are not abstract geopolitical data points. They are a reminder that the guarantees which protected European peace for 80 years are not self-enforcing. They require countries with the will and the capacity to uphold them. And right now, the country that has most consistently undermined those guarantees is announcing ceasefires, violating them 1,820 times, and waiting to see what the response is. The response so far has been more diplomatic language, more calls for both sides to show restraint, more discussions about peace plans, more ceasefire proposals, and more Russian missiles hitting Ukrainian cities. There is a moment coming, it may already have arrived, when European governments are going to have to make a decision that they have been avoiding for years. Not whether to support Ukraine, that decision has been made, but how much, in what form, and with what conditions. Because the alternative, the scenario where Russian ceasefire violations continue to be met with diplomatic statements while the actual military situation on the ground deteriorates, does not end with a negotiated peace. It ends with a different kind of peace, one that looks like a map where the lines have been redrawn by force, where a country that was invaded has been required to accept the loss of its territory, and where every other nation watching has updated its understanding of what the international rules actually mean. Russia violated Ukraine's ceasefire 1,820 times in a single day. But here is what makes this moment genuinely different from every previous ceasefire violation in this war: the timing. These violations did not happen in a vacuum. They happened at precisely the moment when diplomatic activity around this conflict is at its highest point in years. Trump is engaged. European leaders are meeting. Peace proposals are being drafted and debated. The Istanbul talks happened. Abu Dhabi talks happened. Geneva talks happened. The world has never been more focused on finding a way out of this war than it is right now. And Russia chose this moment. This specific, historically significant moment of maximum diplomatic attention to launch 1,820 violations in a single day. That is not an accident. That is a message. The message is directed at multiple audiences simultaneously. To Ukraine, it says, no amount of diplomatic maneuvering will change your military reality. To Europe, it says, your support for Ukraine has not changed our calculus. To Trump, it says, we will give you a ceasefire announcement for the cameras, but we will not give you an actual ceasefire. And the most dangerous part of this message is not the content. It is the confidence. Russia is firing 1,820 violations into a day when the entire world is watching and saying, so what? What are you going to do about it? That confidence, that absolute certainty that the violations will not produce meaningful consequences, is what makes this moment so critical. Because confidence in international relations is contagious. When one actor demonstrates that it can violate rules without consequence, other actors notice. They update their own risk calculations. They test their own limits a little further. The world has been here before, in the 1930s, in the years when small violations of international norms went unanswered and were followed by larger ones. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes in ways that should make anyone paying attention deeply uncomfortable. 1,820 violations, 27 civilians dead, and the response from the international community has been more statements, more meetings, more proposals. Russia is counting on the gap between words and actions to give it everything it wants without ever having to stop the war.